Hello, everyone. Welcome to English Insights. Today, we will learn about Operation Ranch Hand, a campaign launched by the United States during the Vietnam War. In this operation, the U.S. military sprayed a chemical called Agent Orange over forest and farmland in Vietnam. This video will show you how the operation was carried out, how it harmed the people in the war, and the effects it left on next generations in both Vietnam and the United States. At the same time, you can naturally improve your listening skill through a real topic. Now, let's get started. Part 1. The beginning of the war and the idea for a new weapon, 1961. In the early 1960s, the United States was deeply involved in Vietnam. American soldiers and their allies were fighting against the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong, a group of fighters in the South. The war was very difficult for the Americans. The Vietnamese fighters knew the forests well. They lived in the jungle and used it to hide. The jungle had tall trees, thick plants, and big leaves, making it almost impossible to see the enemy. The Vietnamese used guerrilla tactics. They attacked suddenly and then disappeared into the forest. American soldiers, with their heavy weapons and large groups, found it very hard to fight this kind of war. The jungle gave the Viet Cong a strong advantage. The U.S. military faced two main problems. First, they could not see or reach the enemy because of the thick forest. Second, the Vietnamese fighters had food hidden in secret farms and rice fields under the trees. This food allowed them to fight for a long time. If the U.S. wanted to win, they had to solve both problems, remove the jungle cover, and destroy the food supply. From this need came a new idea. Instead of using more soldiers or bigger bombs, the U.S. decided to use chemicals. These chemicals could kill plants by making the leaves fall off trees and by destroying crops. The plan was called Operation Ranch Hand. The chemicals were stored in large barrels marked with colored stripes. Each color showed a different type of chemical. The most famous was the orange striped barrel, which held Agent Orange. Other chemicals also had code names, such as Agent Blue, used to destroy rice, and Agent White, used in places near villages. In 1961, the first small missions began. U.S. planes flew low over forests and sprayed the chemicals into the air. The mist covered the trees, farms, and land below. American leaders told the public that the chemicals were safe, only meant for plants. They said they would not hurt people or animals, but this was not true. Both the government and the chemical companies knew that these mixtures contained a dangerous poison. Still, they chose to continue, believing it would help them win the war. At first, the spraying was just a test, a way to see if the plan worked. But soon, it became one of the largest and most damaging operations of the entire war. Part 2. How Agent Orange was used, 1962 to 1971. After the first test, in 1961, the U.S. military quickly expanded the spraying program. Between 1962 and 1971, Operation Ranch Hand became one of the largest chemical campaigns in history. The goal was simple: take away the jungle cover and destroy crops that fed the enemy. But the way it was done was massive and shocking. Special planes called C-123 Provider aircraft were changed into spraying machines. Each plane carried large tanks filled with Agent Orange and other chemicals. When flying low, the planes released the liquid into the air, turning it into a fine mist that covered everything below. Soldiers on the ground also used trucks, boats, and even handheld sprayers to spread the chemicals in smaller areas. The scale of the operation was enormous. Over 19 million gallons of herbicides were sprayed across South Vietnam. Nearly 12 million gallons of this was Agent Orange, making it the most widely used. The chemicals were spread across forests, jungles, mangrove swamps, and farmlands. Entire areas of Vietnam turned brown and dead within weeks. The U.S. military believed this would break the enemy's strength. Without the jungle, the Viet Cong would have no place to hide. Without crops, they would have no food to eat. American commanders reported that the spraying made it easier to see enemy bases, trails, and camps from the air. They thought it was a clever solution to a difficult war. But the chemicals did not stay only on the trees. They soaked into the soil, rivers, and drinking water. Villages and farms were sprayed by accident, or sometimes even on purpose. Farmers lost their rice fields, fruit trees, and vegetable gardens. Families who depended on their land for survival suddenly had nothing to eat. American soldiers themselves were also exposed. Many units were ordered to move through areas that had just been sprayed. Some even helped to load the chemicals into the planes without protective gear. At the time, most of them believed it was safe because that was what they were told. They did not know they were breathing in a dangerous poison. The heart of the problem was not just the herbicide itself, but a deadly chemical inside it, dioxin. Dioxin is extremely toxic, even in very small amounts. It can stay in the soil for decades and build up inside the body. Scientists later discovered that dioxin causes cancer, damages the immune system, and creates birth defects in children. But during the war, this information was hidden or ignored. By the late 1960s, some scientists began to raise questions about Agent Orange. Reports appeared of strange health problems among both Vietnamese villagers and American soldiers. Some children were born with serious deformities. Animals died after drinking water from sprayed areas. Despite these warnings, the spraying continued for almost 10 years. Operation Ranch Hand only ended In 1971, long after the U.S. had already started withdrawing troops from Vietnam. By then, millions of acres of forest had been destroyed, and countless lives had already been affected. The war moved on, but the poison stayed in the land, water, and people. Part 3. The immediate effects on Vietnam, 1960s to 1970s. The spraying of Agent Orange left deep and painful scars on Vietnam. The first and most visible change was in the land itself. Lush green forests quickly turned brown and lifeless. Trees lost their leaves, and within weeks, huge areas looked like they had been burned by fire. Birds and animals that depended on the jungle disappeared. The natural balance of the land was broken. Entire villages suddenly found themselves in the middle of a dead zone. Farmers lost their crops after one spray. Rice fields withered, fruit trees stopped growing, and vegetable gardens turned yellow. For many families, this meant hunger. In some places, people were forced to leave their land because it could no longer produce food. But the damage was not only to nature, it was also to people. Vietnamese villagers living in sprayed areas often had no way to protect themselves. Planes sprayed directly over their homes, schools, and fields. Children played in the mist, not knowing it was poison. People drank water from rivers and wells already contaminated with chemicals. The exposure was constant, and the effects were immediate. Many villagers soon began to suffer from strange illnesses. Skin rashes, breathing problems, and stomach pain became common. Pregnant women, who had been exposed, sometimes lost their babies. Others gave birth to children with severe defects. These were things that families had never seen before. Local doctors did not understand what was happening. Animals also suffered. Water buffalo, chickens, and pigs, the main sources of food, and farming help, died after eating sprayed grass or drinking dirty water. For poor families, the loss of their animals was almost as painful as the loss of their crops. It meant they had even fewer chances to survive. The Vietnamese fighters were affected too. The U.S. military had hoped that destroying the jungle would make the enemy weak, but the Viet Cong often adapted. They built new tunnels, moved supplies at night, and continued to hide in smaller forested areas. While the chemical attacks hurt the land and the people, they did not fully remove the enemy's ability to fight. For ordinary villagers, life became a daily struggle. They lived with fear every time a plane flew overhead. Even if the mission was not near their home, they could never be sure. Sometimes the wind carried the spray for kilometers, reaching places far away from the original target. No one felt safe. In the short term, Operation Ranch Hand created both destruction and despair. Forests were stripped bare, farms collapsed, and thousands of families were left hungry and sick. What many people did not yet know was that The worst effects were still to come. The poison did not disappear after the spraying stopped. It stayed in the soil, in the rivers, and in the bodies of the people who had been exposed. The war moved forward, but the seeds of a longer tragedy had already been planted. Part 4. The Long-Term Health Impact. The most terrible effects of Agent Orange did not appear immediately. They showed up slowly, year after year. The poison inside the chemical, called dioxin, stayed in the soil, the rivers, and even in the bodies of people. Unlike other poisons, it did not go away quickly. It stayed for decades, silently harming anyone who touched or ate contaminated food or water. For many Vietnamese families, sickness became part of everyday life. People living in sprayed areas often developed serious diseases. Different kinds of cancer appeared more often than before. Many villagers had strange skin problems that did not heal. Others suffered from nerve damage, which made it hard to move their arms or legs. Even young people, who should have been healthy, sometimes grew weak and sick. One of the most painful effects was on pregnant women and children. Many mothers who had been exposed to Agent Orange gave birth to babies with severe birth defects. Some children were born without arms or legs. Others were born blind, deaf, or with mental disabilities. Families who had never seen such conditions before were heartbroken. Parents often felt guilt and sadness, even though the problem was not their fault. Doctors in Vietnam began to notice a pattern. In areas where Agent Orange was sprayed, the number of birth defects was much higher than in other places. Some villages had many children with disabilities, sometimes in the same family across several generations. This showed that the poison did not only hurt the people directly exposed, but also their children and grandchildren. The poison had entered the human gene line. The health problems were not only physical, they also caused deep emotional suffering. Families with sick children often faced poverty because parents had to spend all their time caring for their sons or daughters. Some families were rejected by their communities because people did not understand why so many children were born with disabilities. The pain was both medical and social. The American veterans also faced the same problems. Soldiers who had worked with or near Agent Orange developed similar diseases: cancer, diabetes, skin disorders, and nerve problems. Many veterans also had children with birth defects. For years, they fought for recognition and medical support from their government. In both Vietnam and the United States, Agent Orange became a symbol of pain that lasted long after the war ended. Another long-term problem was in the environment. The soil and rivers in Vietnam were poisoned for decades. In some areas, fish and other animals were unsafe to eat because they carried dioxin inside their bodies. Farmers who tried to grow food often found their crops weak or strange tasting. Whole regions became known as hotspots, places where the poison levels were extremely high. These areas remained dangerous for many years after the spraying stopped. The Vietnamese government, with help from international organizations, tried to provide care for victims. Special hospitals and centers were built to help children with disabilities caused by Agent Orange. Volunteers and doctors worked hard, but the number of victims was so large that it was impossible to help everyone. Even today, many families still suffer without enough support. The long-term impact of Agent Orange shows how one decision in war can affect millions of lives for generations. It was not just about the soldiers on the battlefield. It was about children, families, villages, and the land itself. The poison became part of the story of Vietnam, a story that continues even now. Part 5. The Struggle of American Veterans. When the war ended in 1975, many American soldiers returned home. They expected to leave the horrors of Vietnam behind, but for thousands of them, the war followed them back, in their own bodies. Agent Orange had not only poisoned the forests of Vietnam, it had also poisoned the men who served there. At first, many veterans did not understand why they were getting sick. Some developed strange rashes on their skin. Others felt tired all the time or had problems with breathing. Many began to suffer from cancers, like Hodgkin's disease, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and prostate cancer. Younger men, who should have been strong and healthy, suddenly faced deadly illnesses. The situation became worse when their children were born. Many veterans noticed that their babies had serious health problems, including birth defects similar to those seen in Vietnam. Some children were born with missing limbs or weak immune systems. Fathers and mothers began to ask questions. Was Agent Orange the reason? For years, the U.S. government denied any connection. Officials said there was no proof that Agent Orange caused these health problems. Veterans felt ignored and betrayed. They had risked their lives for their country, but now they were being told that their suffering was not real. Many of them began to organize and protest. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, groups of veterans formed organizations to fight for recognition. They demanded that the government take responsibility and provide medical care. One of the most important organizations was the Vietnam Veterans of America, VVA, which became a strong voice for those affected by Agent Orange. The struggle was long and painful. Veterans had to provide evidence, share personal stories, and fight in court. Finally, in 1984, a major step was taken. Several chemical companies that had produced Agent Orange agreed to pay $180 million in a settlement with American veterans. This was one of the largest legal settlements of its time. However, many veterans felt that the money was not enough. They wanted more than financial support. They wanted recognition of the truth. They wanted their government to admit that Agent Orange was dangerous and that it had harmed both soldiers and their families. Over the years, the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, VA, slowly began to recognize certain illnesses as being connected to Agent Orange. This meant that veterans suffering from these diseases could receive medical care and disability payments. The list of recognized diseases grew longer over time, including different cancers, type 2 diabetes, Parkinson's disease, and more. Even with these victories, many veterans continued to struggle. Some had been sick for years without proper care. Others had already died before the government admitted the truth. Families carried the weight of both illness and financial problems. The fight for justice was, and still is, a continuing battle. The story of American veterans shows another side of the tragedy of Agent Orange. It was not only the Vietnamese people who suffered. The very soldiers sent to carry out Operation Ranch Hand became victims themselves. They returned home carrying invisible wounds, wounds that could not be seen, but that destroyed their health, their families, and their trust in the government. Part 6: Memory, Justice, and Healing. The story of Agent Orange did not end when the last plane stopped spraying in 1971. Its shadow still lies over both Vietnam and the United States. The fight for justice, the search for healing, and the effort to keep memory alive continue, even today. In Vietnam, millions of people still live with the effects of the poison. Some families care for children and grandchildren with serious disabilities. In villages near the hot spots, the poison remains in the soil and rivers. Farmers work hard, but some land still cannot grow healthy crops. People try to live normal lives, but the memory of the spraying is never far away. The Vietnamese government, along with international partners, has created programs to help victims. Special care centers have been built for children with disabilities. Doctors, nurses, and volunteers provide therapy, education, and support. In recent years, the United States has also taken part in cleanup projects. One of the biggest efforts was in Da Nang, where tons of poisoned soil were treated to remove dioxin. This was a small but important step toward healing. For American veterans, the struggle has also continued. The U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs now recognizes many illnesses connected to Agent Orange. Veterans can receive treatment and financial support. But even with these programs, many still feel that justice came too late. Some soldiers died before their illnesses were recognized. Their families had to carry the pain without help. Beyond health and money, there is the question of memory. How should history remember the story of Agent Orange? For some, it is a lesson about the dangers of chemical warfare. For others, It is a reminder of the human cost of war, not only on the battlefield, but in the lives of civilians, families, and future generations. Writers, filmmakers, and activists continue to tell the story. Memorials and museums in Vietnam keep the memory alive for new generations. In the United States, veterans groups share their experiences so that people will not forget. The hope is that by remembering, the world can avoid repeating the same mistakes. Justice is not easy to measure. No amount of money or apology can erase the suffering of those affected. But every step, whether it is medical care, cleanup projects, or public recognition, brings a small piece of healing. It shows that the victims are not forgotten and that their pain is acknowledged. In both countries, there are also signs of reconciliation. American and Vietnamese organizations now work together to support victims and clean the environment. What was once a symbol of destruction is slowly becoming a place for cooperation. Healing is slow, but it is happening. The story of Agent Orange is not only about the past, it is about the present and the future. It teaches the world about the dangers of using chemicals in war. It shows how decisions made in one moment can hurt generations. And it reminds us that justice and healing require patience, courage, and memory. Today, the forests of Vietnam are growing again. Children play in villages that were once sprayed. Veterans gather to share their stories, both painful and hopeful. The poison left scars, but the people continue to live, remember, and rebuild. The memory of Agent Orange will never disappear, but the efforts toward justice and healing can give meaning to the suffering and hope for the future.